The iron manacles weighed 11 pounds when empty. Sarah Carter kept 3 sets hanging from her saddle at all times, polished clean each Sunday after church. On the morning of August 15th, 1829, a farmer named Eli Thornton found her sitting in his barn before dawn, boots propped on a feed barrel, rifle across her lap, waiting. She had been there for 6 hours. She knew exactly who was hiding in his hayloft, knew their names, knew what they were worth. When Thornton asked how long she planned to stay, Sarah smiled and said, "As long as it takes." She was 34 years old, stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, and had captured 87 people in 4 years. The manacles on her saddle bore scratches from all of them. Some said she could track a person through running water. Others claimed she paid children to spy on their own families. What nobody disputed was this: if you ran and Sarah Carter took your contract, you were already caught. You just didn't know it yet. The house on Carter's Ridge sat 7 miles south of Louisville, where the road bent toward the Ohio River and the air always smelled of coal smoke and wet limestone. The property had belonged to Sarah's husband, Thomas Carter, a tobacco buyer who died of cholera in the summer of 1825, leaving her with 43 acres of exhausted soil, a mortgage she couldn't pay, and no children to help work the land. The bank gave her 6 months. Her neighbors, mostly Baptist families who had known Thomas since childhood, offered prayers and casseroles, but no money. By December of that year, Sarah had sold the tobacco equipment, the furniture, the chickens, everything except the house itself and her husband's hunting rifle. She was 30 years old and facing eviction when Jacob Wardell came to see her. Wardell ran a hiring agency in Louisville that matched skilled workers with employers, but he also kept a private ledger of another kind. Plantation owners paid him to coordinate the capture of people who had fled bondage. Wardell didn't do the work himself. He subcontracted to men willing to ride hard, ask few questions, and deliver human property back to its legal owners for a percentage of the posted reward. Most of his contractors were rough men from the riverfront districts, former militia who drank too much and couldn't hold regular work. Sarah Carter was neither rough nor male, and when Wardell explained why he had come, she asked 3 questions. How much does it pay? How soon do I start? Do I get the rifle back if they kill me? Wardell liked the last question. It showed practical thinking. He offered her a contract that evening. Sarah's first assignment came in January of 1826. A man named Marcus, 28 years old, had disappeared from the Breckenridge plantation south of Bardstown on the night of December 20th. The owner posted a $50 reward. Sarah studied the physical description, the list of known associates, the likely routes north toward the river crossing at West Point. She spent 2 days riding the back roads between Bardstown and Louisville, stopping at every farm, every mill, every tavern. She asked simple questions. Had anyone seen a stranger? Had anyone's dogs barked in the night? Had anyone noticed tracks near their well or missing food from their smokehouse? On the 3rd day, she found Marcus hiding in a root cellar beneath a Quaker family's barn near Shepherdsville. The family claimed ignorance. Sarah didn't argue. She collected Marcus at gunpoint, shackled him, and brought him to Wardell's office in Louisville within 4 hours. The Breckenridge overseer arrived the next morning to verify the capture and pay the reward. Sarah took her percentage, paid that month's mortgage, and asked Wardell for another contract. Over the next 4 years, she developed a reputation built on relentless efficiency. She tracked a woman named Hannah through 3 counties by following the pattern of borrowed clothes from wash lines. She found 2 brothers hiding in a cave system south of Elizabethtown by mapping every natural shelter within a day's walk of their owner's property. She captured a 15-year-old girl by befriending the free black family who had taken her in, eating dinner at their table, then returning after midnight with shackles. The girl had been 3 miles from the Ohio River, 3 miles from a skiff that would have carried her to freedom. Sarah collected $60 for that capture. She used it to buy a better saddle. The mechanics of the work were simple. Plantation owners filed reports with county clerks listing the names, ages, and physical descriptions of people who had fled. These reports included estimated directions of travel and offered rewards ranging from $25 to $200, depending on the person's age, health, and skills. The reports were copied and distributed to sheriffs, ferry operators, and private contractors like Wardell. Sarah studied them the way merchants studied market prices. She understood that time mattered. The longer someone was missing, the farther they could travel, the more likely they were to reach free territory. Speed was worth money. But Sarah's real innovation was patience married to systems. She didn't chase, she predicted. She studied maps of Kentucky's river crossings, identified the bottleneck points where anyone moving north would have to pass, and she cultivated a network of informants. Stable hands, laundresses, children, store clerks, ferry workers. She paid them small amounts for information, $1 here, 50 cents there. She learned who had relatives working on which plantations, who attended which churches, who could be trusted to report strangers. She built a web across 8 counties, and that web caught people before they knew they were trapped. By 1829, Jacob Wardle's ledger showed Sarah Carter had successfully captured 87 people. Her contracts came from some of the wealthiest families in Kentucky. The Breckinridges, the Wycliffes, the Clays. She had saved her house, paid off her mortgage, and accumulated enough money to buy adjoining property. She rode a black gelding that could cover 40 miles in a day. She wore men's riding clothes and carried her rifle slung across her back where everyone could see it. She was known, she was feared, and she had just accepted a contract that would change everything. The paperwork arrived at Sarah's house on September 2nd, 1829, delivered by one of Wardle's clerks. 5 people had fled the Kavanaugh plantation in Nelson County on the night of August 27th. 2 men, 2 women, and a child, age 6. The child's name was listed as Eliza. The reward for the group's return was $300, the largest Sarah had ever seen for a single contract. What made the case unusual was the coordination. 5 people disappearing together suggested planning, resources, outside help. Someone had sheltered them. Someone had provided food, directions, maybe transportation. Sarah read the descriptions twice. The men were field workers, ages 32 and 41. The women were listed as house servants, ages 26 and 28. The child was described as small for her age, quiet, obedient. The physical details were precise. Scars, marks, specific heights. The kind of precision that came from daily observation, from ownership that cataloged bodies the way farmers cataloged livestock. Sarah accepted the contract that afternoon. She began by visiting the Kavanaugh plantation herself. The property sat on the Rolling Fork River, fertile bottomland that produced hemp and tobacco. The main house was 3 stories, brick, with white columns and a reputation for harsh discipline. The overseer, a man named Pike, met Sarah at the gate and walked her through the quarters where the missing people had lived. Pike showed her the cabin the men had shared, the separate cabin for the women and child. He pointed out the last places each person had been seen on August 27th. He speculated they had left sometime after midnight, heading northwest toward the Salt River crossing. Sarah asked different questions. Who were their friends? Who might have hidden them? Were there any white families in the area known to harbor runaways? Any Quaker settlements? Any Methodist congregations that preached abolition? Pike provided names. Sarah wrote them in her notebook, a small leather-bound volume she carried in her coat pocket. She asked about the child. Who was Eliza to the others? The daughter of one of the women, Pike said. The younger woman, Rachel. The girl's father had been sold to Mississippi 2 years prior. Sarah absorbed this. A mother with a 6-year-old, traveling with 3 adults. That changed the logistics. Small children couldn't walk long distances quickly. They cried. They needed frequent rest, food, comfort. A group moving with a child would be slower, more visible, more dependent on help from people along the route. And help left traces. She spent 3 days mapping a radius around the Kavanaugh plantation. She visited every farm, every church, every mill within 10 miles. She asked her usual questions. Strangers? Missing food? Dogs barking? Most people said no. A few mentioned seeing travelers on the road, but the descriptions didn't match. On the 4th day, Sarah found something. A family named Morrison, Methodists who farmed a small property near Cox's Creek, had neighbors who mentioned seeing lights in the Morrison barn after midnight on August 28th. The neighbors hadn't thought much of it. Barn animals sometimes got loose and needed tending at night. But the timing was right. Sarah arrived at the Morrison property at dawn on September 6th, 1829. She found boot prints in the mud near the barn, multiple sets, including small prints that could have belonged to a child. She found fresh straw scattered in one corner where someone had slept. And she found something else. A small piece of cloth, torn from a dress, caught on a nail near the back door. The fabric was homespun cotton, dyed indigo, the kind enslaved women wore. Sarah folded the cloth and put it in her pocket. Then she knocked on the Morrison house door. A woman answered, maybe 50 years old, with gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Sarah introduced herself, said she was investigating reports of trespassers in the area. The woman, whose name was Martha Morrison, said she knew nothing about trespassers. Her husband was away in Louisville on business. She was alone with her elderly father, who was bedridden. She had no information to provide. Sarah thanked her politely and left. But she didn't leave the area. She rode a half-mile down the road, tied her horse in a grove of trees, and walked back to the Morrison property on foot. She found a position in the woods where she could watch the house and barn without being seen, and she waited. This was the part of the work most men couldn't tolerate. The sitting, the watching, the hours passing while nothing happened. But Sarah had learned that people revealed their secrets in small actions. A glance toward the barn, a trip to the well at an unusual time, food carried from the house in larger quantities than one person needed. She watched through the afternoon and into the evening. She watched until darkness fell and the house went dark. At 11:43 that night, a light appeared in the Morrison barn. Sarah stayed hidden until she was certain Martha Morrison had returned to the house. Then she moved quietly to the barn, her rifle loaded but held low. The door was barred from inside. Sarah knocked once, soft enough not to carry to the house. No answer. She knocked again, harder. A voice inside, male, asked who was there. Sarah said her name, said she knew 5 people were hiding in the barn, said they could come, out now and face capture, or she could return with the sheriff and make this official. Either way, she said, the outcome was the same. The barn door opened from inside. The two men stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the lamplight. Behind them, Sarah could see the women and the child. Eliza was sitting on a hay bale, her small face streaked with dirt. Rachel, her mother, held the girl's hand. The other woman stood near the back wall, watching Sarah with an expression that held no surprise, only exhaustion. They had known this moment was coming. Perhaps they had always known. Sarah shackled the men first, wrists and ankles, connecting them with a chain that allowed them to walk but not run. Then she shackled the women the same way. The child she left free, but she told Rachel that if Eliza tried to run, Sarah would shackle her too. No one resisted. Resistance was pointless. Sarah had the rifle, the legal authority, and the certainty of people who knew the system protected her and punished them. She took them back to the Morrison house and knocked on the door again. Martha Morrison answered in her nightgown, holding a candle. Her face confirmed what Sarah already knew. The woman had been hiding them. She had fed them, sheltered them, and likely planned to move them north to the next station on the Underground Railroad. Sarah didn't ask for a confession. She didn't need one. The evidence was sufficient. What happened next depended on how charitable Sarah felt that night. She could report Martha Morrison to the sheriff for harboring fugitives, which carried fines and possible imprisonment. Or she could accept the woman's cooperation, take the 5 people, and let the Morrison family escape punishment. Sarah chose the latter, not from mercy, but from pragmatism. Arresting Martha would mean delays, paperwork, testimony. It would slow the process and reduce Sarah's efficiency. Better to take what she came for and move on. She brought the 5 people back to Louisville that night, traveling slowly because of the child. Eliza walked when she could, rode on one of the men's shoulders when she couldn't. They reached the city at dawn on September 7th. Sarah delivered them to Wardle's office, where the Kavanaugh overseer verified their identities and paid the $300 reward. Sarah took her percentage, $150, and deposited it with the Louisville branch of the Bank of Kentucky. The 5 people were returned to the Kavanaugh plantation that afternoon. What happened to them after that was not Sarah's concern. Her contract ended when she delivered them to Wardell. Whether they faced punishment, sale, or some other consequence was a matter for their owner. Sarah had done her job. She had tracked them, found them, brought them back. The system had worked as designed, but something about the Morrison barn stayed with her. The way the 5 people had looked at her in that lamplight. Not with hatred, which she had seen before. Not with fear, which was common. But with something else. A kind of knowing. As if they understood her better than she understood herself. As if they saw the choice she was making, the work she was doing, the side of history she had placed herself on, and they were marking it. Remembering it. Holding it in their minds as something that would matter later, when the ledgers were finally settled. Sarah didn't dwell on this. She had another contract waiting, and the September weather was good for tracking. The leaves hadn't turned yet, and the ground was soft enough to hold prints. She rode south toward Bardstown, where a man named Peter had disappeared from the Guthrie plantation 3 days earlier. The reward was $75. Sarah planned to earn it by the end of the week. By the autumn of 1829, Sarah Carter had informants in 11 Kentucky counties. The network had grown organically over 4 years, built on small payments and the understanding that information was currency. A stable hand who mentioned seeing strangers at a particular farm might receive 25 cents. A ferry operator who reported unusual crossings could earn 50. A store clerk who noticed someone purchasing supplies in quantities that suggested feeding extra mouths might collect $1. The amounts were modest, but they accumulated. And for people on the margins of Kentucky's economy, laborers and service workers and small farmers struggling to pay their own debts, those modest amounts mattered. The network's most valuable members were children. Sarah had learned early that children noticed things adults missed. They watched travelers on roads, overheard conversations their parents thought were private, and remembered details with accuracy adults rarely matched. A 12-year-old boy in Shepherdsville named Thomas Pryor earned $3 over the course of 1829 by reporting to Sarah every time his mother, who ran a boarding house, provided rooms to black travelers. The boy kept his arrangement with Sarah secret from his mother. He saw it as extra income, pocket money for candy, and small luxuries his family couldn't afford. He didn't think of it as betrayal. He thought of it as business. Sarah kept meticulous records of her informants in a separate ledger she stored in a locked drawer at her house. The ledger listed names, locations, amounts paid, and the quality of information each person provided. Some informants were reliable. Others provided vague reports that went nowhere. Sarah adjusted her payments accordingly. Reliable informants received bonuses. Unreliable ones were dropped from the network. She ran the system with the same efficiency she applied to tracking. Every dollar spent on information needed to produce a return in captured people and collected rewards. The network's existence was not secret. People in Louisville's black community knew about it, whispered about it, tried to identify which of their neighbors might be reporting to Sarah Carter. But knowing the network existed and proving who belonged to it were different things. Sarah's informants were careful. They didn't announce their cooperation. They passed information discreetly, often through intermediaries, and they benefited from plausible deniability. If confronted, they could claim they had merely mentioned seeing strangers in the area, not knowing what the information would be used for. This thin pretense allowed them to maintain relationships in their communities while still collecting Sarah's payments. The network's impact was devastating. People planning escapes didn't know who to trust. Free black families offering shelter couldn't be certain their actions weren't being observed and reported. White families sympathetic to abolition had to assume every visitor might carry information back to Sarah. The uncertainty itself became a tool of control. If you couldn't trust your neighbors, if you couldn't know who was watching, you either stopped helping or you planned so carefully, with such paranoia and isolation, that the psychological cost became nearly as high as the physical danger. In October of 1829, a man named Isaac disappeared from the Gentry plantation in Oldham County. The owner posted a $40 reward. Sarah received information within 12 hours. One of her informants, a woman who worked as a laundress in Westport, reported that Isaac had been seen near the ferry landing, speaking with the operator's assistant about crossing times. Sarah rode to Westport immediately. She questioned the ferry operator, who confirmed that someone matching Isaac's description had asked about passage to Indiana. The operator had refused, citing the legal requirement to verify free status before allowing black travelers to cross into free territory. But Sarah had a theory. If Isaac couldn't cross legally, he might try to cross illegally, which meant hiring someone with a small boat, someone willing to row him across the river at night for payment. Sarah identified 3 men in Westport who owned boats suitable for such crossings. She visited each of them. The first 2 denied knowledge of Isaac. The third, a man named Crawford, became nervous when Sarah asked her questions. His nervousness was answer enough. Sarah didn't threaten Crawford. She didn't need to. She simply explained that she would be watching the river near his property for the next several nights. If Isaac appeared, Sarah would collect him. If Crawford was involved in helping Isaac, Sarah would report him to the county sheriff for violating the fugitive slave statutes. Crawford understood. That evening, he sent a message to Isaac through an intermediary, telling him the planned crossing was compromised. Isaac, believing the route was no longer safe, changed his plans. He decided to travel east instead, hoping to reach the mountains and eventually Virginia, where some enslaved people had found refuge in remote areas. Sarah anticipated this. She sent messages to her informants in Shelby County and Spencer County, alerting them to watch for Isaac. 3 days later, a store clerk in Taylorsville reported seeing someone matching Isaac's description, purchasing cornmeal and dried beans. Sarah rode to Taylorsville and found Isaac sleeping in a tobacco barn 2 miles from town. She shackled him and brought him back to the Gentry plantation on October 9th. The owner paid the $40 reward. Sarah added Crawford's name to a list she kept of people who were cooperative but required watching. The capture of Isaac was typical of how Sarah's network functioned. A single piece of information, even negative information like Crawford's refusal to assist, could be weaponized into capture. The network created a surveillance state in miniature, where every interaction, every request for help, every conversation about routes and crossings became data that fed back to Sarah. And the people caught in that web often didn't know they were caught until the shackles were already on. The Society of Friends had been active in Kentucky since the 1790s, establishing small communities that maintained their religious principles even in slave territory. By 1829, Quaker settlements existed in several counties, notably in Hardin County near Elizabethtown and in Warren County near Bowling Green. The Friends' religious testimony against slavery created a complicated situation. They didn't publicly operate stations on the Underground Railroad, but their communities became known as places where desperate people sometimes sought shelter. And Sarah Carter knew this. The problem for Sarah was that Quaker communities protected their own. They were insular, tight-knit, and suspicious of outsiders. When Sarah visited Quaker farms asking questions about missing travelers, the families gave polite, unhelpful answers. They had seen no one. They knew nothing. Their testimony, given without oaths because Quakers refused to swear, carried a strange authority. They would not lie, but they would carefully construct their words to avoid revealing information. If Sarah asked, "Have you seen a black man traveling north?" they might answer, "I have seen many people on the roads this month." The answer was true and useless. Sarah understood she needed different tactics. In November of 1829, she took a contract for a woman named Judith who had fled the Hardin plantation near Elizabethtown. The reward was $55. Sarah's information suggested Judith had connections to the Quaker community near Nolan Creek. Rather than visiting Quaker farms directly, Sarah positioned herself at the roads leading to and from their settlements. She watched who came and went. She noted patterns, and she waited. On the third day of watching, Sarah saw a Quaker farmer named Ezra Whitson leave his property carrying a basket covered with cloth. The basket appeared heavy. Whitson took a path through the woods rather than the main road. Sarah followed at a distance. Whitson walked for nearly an hour before reaching a small cave system south of Nolan Creek. He entered the largest cave, stayed inside for 10 minutes, then emerged with the basket empty. Sarah waited until Whitson left, then approached the cave herself. She found Judith inside, along with another woman and a teenage boy. They had been sheltered in the cave for 5 days, supplied with food and water by Whitson and possibly other Quakers. Judith ran when she saw Sarah. The other woman tried to block Sarah's path. But the cave had only one entrance, and Sarah was armed. She captured all three. The boy and the other woman were not on any contract, but Sarah identified them through Jacob Wardle's network. The boy had fled a plantation in Meade County 2 weeks prior. The woman had been missing from a farm in Grayson County since October. Sarah collected rewards for all three captures, totaling $130. But capturing Judith and the others created a different problem. Ezra Whitson had aided their escape. Under Kentucky law, specifically the statute passed in 1828 that reinforced federal fugitive slave provisions, anyone who harbored or assisted escaping enslaved people faced fines up to $500 and possible imprisonment. Sarah could report Whitson to the sheriff. She had evidence, witnesses, a clear chain of actions. Whitson would almost certainly be convicted. Sarah chose not to report him. Her reasoning was practical. If she prosecuted Whitson, the Quaker community would close ranks completely. They would stop any cooperation, become actively hostile to her presence, and potentially interfere with future tracking. But if she let Whitson escape punishment this time, he would understand she held power over him. He would understand that his freedom depended on her discretion, and he might become more careful, which meant more predictable, which meant easier to monitor. She confronted Whitson at his farm 2 days after the captures. She told him she knew what he had done, had evidence that would convict him, but was choosing not to pursue prosecution. She asked only one thing in return. If Whitson or his community sheltered people in the future, and Sarah came asking questions, Whitson would give her truthful answers. He would not lie. He would not obstruct. He would remember that Sarah had shown mercy, and he would reciprocate with information. Whitson, caught between his religious principles and the threat of prison, agreed. It was a compromise that violated his conscience, but protected his family. He shook Sarah's hand, and the agreement was made. Over the following months, Whitson provided Sarah with 3 pieces of information that led to captures. He did this reluctantly, with visible pain, but he did it. And each time, Sarah reminded him that his cooperation was purchasing his continued freedom from prosecution. The arrangement with Whitson was typical of how Sarah managed the moral ambiguities of her work. She was not cruel for cruelty's sake. She didn't torture or brutalize the people she captured. She didn't take pleasure in their suffering. But she was relentless in her efficiency, and she understood that the system she worked within rewarded results, not methods. If she could achieve captures through information rather than violence, through coercion rather than force, she would do so. The outcome was the same. People returned to bondage, but the path there could be managed. What would you do if you saw your neighbor carrying food into the woods? Would you follow? Would you report? Would you pretend you saw nothing and live with the knowledge that your silence was its own kind of choice? Sarah Carter maintained a private list of contracts she refused. The list was short, written in her ledger under a heading she labeled "Declined." The entries were brief: a name, a date, a reason. Most people never knew the list existed. Jacob Wardell knew because he handled the contract negotiations, and he had learned not to argue when Sarah refused a particular case. She had her reasons, and Wardell respected that she was his most successful contractor. If Sarah Carter said no to a contract, Wardell found someone else. The first pattern in Sarah's refusals involved children under age 10 traveling alone. She would capture families together, as she had with Rachel and Eliza. She would capture older children, teenagers who were physically capable of flight and planning. But very young children who had fled alone represented something Sarah couldn't reconcile. A 6-year-old running away wasn't planning escape. They were lost, desperate, or fleeing immediate violence. Returning them meant returning them to the circumstances that had driven them to run. Sarah had captured Eliza, yes, but Eliza was with her mother. The child wasn't alone. Sarah's line was precise, and she held to it. In December of 1829, a plantation owner named Bingham posted a reward for a 7-year-old boy named Samuel, who had disappeared from a property in Jefferson County. The reward was $30. The description listed multiple scars from whipping. Wardle brought the contract to Sarah. She read it once, noted the scars, noted the age, and declined. She didn't explain her reasoning to Wardle. She simply said the contract didn't suit her and suggested he assign it to one of his male contractors. The boy was captured 3 days later by a man named Harker, who specialized in cases Sarah wouldn't take. Sarah didn't follow what happened to Samuel after that. She didn't want to know. The second pattern involved people who had already reached free territory and were being pursued for return. Kentucky bordered 3 free states: Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The boundary was the Ohio River. If someone successfully crossed, they were legally free under the laws of those states, though federal fugitive slave laws still technically applied. Sarah's contracts always involved people who were still in Kentucky. Once someone crossed the river, they were outside her operational area. She could have tracked them into Ohio or Indiana. Other slave catchers did, but Sarah refused. She told herself this was a practical boundary. Operating in free states carried legal risks, required coordination with hostile local authorities, and often provoked violent resistance from abolitionist communities. But the real reason was simpler. Crossing the river meant someone had escaped. They had won. Sarah could accept that some people won. What she couldn't accept was the work becoming endless, chasing people across the entire country with no natural endpoint. In March of 1830, a wealthy planter from Nelson County offered Sarah $200 to pursue 3 people who had crossed into Indiana near Madison. The trail was fresh. The 3 had been seen in a free black settlement just north of the river. Sarah could have taken the contract. $200 was twice what she usually earned in a month, but she declined. She told the planter she didn't work outside Kentucky. She recommended he hire a contractor based in Indiana who specialized in cross-border captures. The planter was disappointed, but found someone else. The 3 people were never recovered. They had reached a community that protected them, and they disappeared into the network of free black settlements in southern Indiana. The third pattern was more personal and harder to define. Sarah sometimes declined contracts where the circumstances suggested the person who fled had been subjected to specific horrors. Pregnant women fleeing after sexual assault by owners or overseers. People who had been separated from very young children and were trying to reach them. Individuals who had been promised freedom through will or agreement, then betrayed. Sarah's declining these contracts wasn't mercy. She wasn't freeing anyone. Someone else always took the contract. But she was choosing what she would participate in directly, what she would carry in her own memory. She was drawing lines that allowed her to believe she was different from the worst actors in this system, even though the outcomes were the same. In April of 1830, a contract came through for a woman named Margaret, who had fled after her owner's death. The owner's will had promised Margaret her freedom, but the heirs challenged the will and claimed her as property to settle estate debts. Margaret ran rather than face being sold to satisfy creditors. The reward was $60. Sarah read the case details and declined. She told Wardell the legal complications made it unsuitable. But what Sarah didn't say was that Margaret's case reminded her too much of her own situation after Thomas died. The vulnerability of widowhood, the discovery that promises meant nothing when money was involved. Margaret was eventually captured by Harker, the same contractor who had taken the case of young Samuel. Sarah heard later that Margaret had been sold to a cotton plantation in Tennessee. She never reached the freedom her owner's will had promised. Sarah's list of declined contracts was her attempt to maintain some boundary, some line that preserved her sense of being a professional rather than a monster. But the list also revealed how arbitrary those lines were. She would capture a mother and child together, but not a child alone. She would pursue people in Kentucky, but not across the river. She would return people whose owners were legally clear, but not those whose legal status was contested. The boundaries made sense to her, but they made no difference to the people caught on the wrong side of them. Whether Sarah Carter captured you or Harker did, you still ended up in chains. The distinction was meaningful only to Sarah, who needed to believe her work had rules, had limits, had some quality that made it less than the worst version of itself. Margaret Shelby was 19 years old when she arrived in Louisville in the spring of 1830. She was the daughter of Reverend Thomas Shelby, who presided over Second Presbyterian Church on Walnut Street, one of the city's most prominent congregations. Margaret had grown up in a household that owned 3 enslaved people and taught that slavery was ordained by divine providence as a means of civilizing the African race. She had absorbed these teachings, repeated them, believed them without question, until the winter of her 18th year, when she witnessed an event that cracked her certainty. She had been visiting a family friend's plantation in Shelby County when an enslaved man named Joseph attempted to run. The overseer caught him within hours. The punishment was public, performed in front of the other enslaved workers as demonstration. 50 lashes, administered with precision, designed to hurt without permanently damaging the owner's property. Margaret had not intended to watch, but she heard the screaming from the main house and went to the window. She saw the whole thing, the posts Joseph was tied to, the whip rising and falling, the blood, the way Joseph's voice broke from words into sounds. And she saw the white family watching from the porch, sipping tea, barely interrupting their conversation. Something in Margaret broke too, not immediately, not with dramatic revelation, but slowly over weeks and months, as she realized she could no longer reconcile what she had seen with what she had been taught. She began reading abolitionist literature secretly, pamphlets and newspapers smuggled into Louisville from Cincinnati. She attended lectures by traveling ministers who preached against slavery, sitting in the back where her father wouldn't notice. And she began quietly, carefully, testing whether her conscience could find expression in action. In April of 1830, Margaret heard through a friend about a family in Louisville who needed help. A free black woman named Judith Coleman was trying to get her sister out of bondage in Bullitt County. The sister, Anna, had been promised freedom by her dying owner, but the promise had been verbal. The owner's son refused to honor it. Anna planned to run. She needed a place to stay in Louisville for 3 days while arrangements were made for her passage north. Margaret offered her father's carriage house, a detached structure behind the main residence where tools and seasonal equipment were stored. Anna arrived on the night of April 7th, 1830. Margaret brought her food, blankets, a dress that would help her blend in among Louisville's free black population. Margaret's plan was simple: keep Anna hidden for 3 days, then arrange for her to board a steamboat heading to Cincinnati. Once Anna reached Ohio, she would be free. Margaret had everything organized. She had saved money for the boat passage. She had contacted abolitionists in Cincinnati who would help Anna once she arrived. The plan was careful, reasonable, achievable. What Margaret didn't know was that the carriage house was visible from Carter's Ridge, and Sarah Carter, who routinely observed the wealthy neighborhoods of Louisville through a spyglass from her property, had noticed unusual activity behind the Shelby residence. Lights in the carriage house at odd hours. Someone coming and going who didn't match the Shelby household's normal patterns. Sarah recognized Margaret Shelby by sight, knew her father's position, knew the family owned enslaved people. The activity was inconsistent with household routine, which meant it was worth investigating. On the evening of April 9th, Sarah rode into Louisville and positioned herself where she could watch the Shelby property. She saw Margaret bring food to the carriage house at 9:30. She waited until Margaret returned to the main residence, then approached the carriage house herself. She found Anna inside, wearing the dress Margaret had provided, packing a small bag for the trip north. Sarah identified herself, asked Anna her name, asked who owned her, asked who had been helping her. Anna refused to answer the last question. She said Margaret Shelby had no involvement, that she had broken into the carriage house herself, that she was alone. The lie was transparent but brave. Sarah appreciated bravery even when it was futile. She shackled Anna, brought her to Wardle's office, and verified her identity against the posted notices. Anna's owner in Bullitt County was contacted and arrived the next day to reclaim his property. Sarah collected a $45 reward, but Sarah didn't report Margaret Shelby. She could have. Harboring a fugitive was criminal. Margaret's actions were clear, but Sarah made a calculation. Exposing Margaret would create scandal that might touch Sarah's own reputation. Margaret's father was prominent. The church had influence. If Sarah publicly accused the Reverend's daughter of abolitionist sympathies, the backlash could complicate Sarah's relationship with other wealthy families whose contracts she depended on. Better to handle it quietly. Sarah visited Margaret 3 days after Anna's capture. She came to the Shelby residence during the afternoon when the Reverend was at church business. She and Margaret sat in the parlor, and Sarah explained the situation clearly. She knew what Margaret had done. She had evidence. She could report Margaret to the authorities, which would destroy her reputation and possibly result in prosecution. Or Margaret could agree to stop helping fugitives immediately and completely. If Margaret cooperated, Sarah would keep her secret. If Margaret continued, Sarah would expose her. Margaret, 19 years old and terrified, agreed. She stopped attending abolitionist lectures. She stopped reading the smuggled pamphlets. She married a merchant 2 years later and became a conventional wife who owned no enslaved people herself, but never spoke publicly against the institution. She lived until 1874, saw the Civil War end slavery, and never told anyone about her brief attempt at resistance in 1830. The story died with her. Sarah added Margaret's name to a different list in her ledger, a list of people who had been warned and were now being monitored. The list included Ezra Whitson, the Quaker farmer, and several others who had been caught helping but not prosecuted. Sarah used these people as assets. They were coerced informants who occasionally provided information about Underground Railroad activities in exchange for Sarah's continued silence about their past involvement. It was a system of controlled compromise, and it worked because Sarah understood that most people, when forced to choose between their principles and their safety, would choose safety. Margaret Shelby proved this. She had tried conscience, and it had cost her Anna's freedom and nearly her own future. She would not try again. Sarah Carter kept 4 separate ledgers in her house on Carter's Ridge. The first was financial, tracking income and expenses with precision that would have impressed any merchant. The second was her informant network, listing names and payments. The third was the contracts she had completed, a professional record of cases closed and rewards collected. The fourth ledger was different. It had no official purpose. Sarah didn't show it to Jacob Wardell or anyone else. She kept it in a locked drawer in her bedroom, and she wrote in it late at night when the house was quiet and she couldn't sleep. The fourth ledger contained names. Every person Sarah had captured was listed with their age, their owner's name, the date and location of capture, and the reward amount. But the ledger also contained details that had no business function. Physical descriptions more thorough than the wanted notices required. Notes about how people reacted when they were caught. Whether they fought or submitted. Whether they cried or stayed silent. Whether they had family members who were present. What they said in the moments before Sarah shackled them. A man named Benjamin, captured near Bardstown in 1827, had asked Sarah if she had children. When she said no, he said, "Good, then you'll never know what you took from me." Sarah wrote this in the ledger. A woman named Ruth, captured with her teenage son in 1828, had prayed aloud during the entire journey back to Louisville. She prayed for Sarah's soul. She prayed that Sarah would one day understand the weight of what she was doing. Sarah wrote this too. A teenage girl named Alice, captured alone near the Ohio River in 1829, had stopped running when she saw Sarah's rifle. She had stood completely still and said, "You'll remember me. When you're old and you can't sleep, you'll remember my face." Sarah wrote the words exactly as Alice had spoken them. The fourth ledger was Sarah's private record of the human cost of her work. She didn't keep it from guilt. She kept it because she needed to remember that the people she captured were people, with names and voices and thoughts that extended beyond the monetary values attached to them in contracts. The ledger was her attempt to acknowledge what she was doing, to not hide behind the legal language of property recovery and fugitive apprehension. She was taking people. She was returning them to bondage. The ledger made that fact unavoidable, but acknowledgement didn't lead to change. Sarah continued working. She continued accepting contracts. The fourth ledger grew longer, more names, more details, more statements from people who knew they were being captured and wanted Sarah to know what it meant. By the end of 1830, the ledger contained 114 names. Sarah was 35 years old. She had been doing this work for 5 years. She had captured more people than any other contractor in Wardell's network. She had earned enough money to secure her financial future. She owned her property outright, had savings, had investments in Louisville businesses. She could have stopped. She chose not to. Why? The question was worth examining. Sarah told herself she continued because she was good at the work, because it was profitable, because she had built a system that would be wasted if she walked away. But there was something else, harder to name. The work gave her a role, an identity, a kind of power that had been unavailable to her as Thomas Carter's widow. As a slave catcher, she was known. She was feared. She was someone who mattered in Kentucky's economy. Men who would have dismissed her in any other context now needed her skills. She had gone from being invisible to being essential. This transformation came at a specific cost. Sarah had no friends. She had professional relationships with Wardell and his network, transactional connections with informants, and formal interactions with plantation owners who hired her. But she had no one she could speak to honestly, no one who knew her beyond her reputation. She attended church on Sundays, Second Presbyterian, where Reverend Shelby still preached, and Margaret Shelby sat in the family pew, avoiding Sarah's eyes. But Sarah didn't participate in the social gatherings after service. She didn't join the women's charitable societies. She existed at the edge of Louisville's community, useful but not welcome. On Christmas Day of 1830, Sarah ate dinner alone in her house. She had been invited to her late husband's family's gathering, but the invitation was obligatory, extended from duty rather than desire. She declined. She spent the day reviewing her ledgers, planning which contracts to pursue in the new year, and she wrote in her fourth ledger, not about a capture, but about herself. She wrote that she understood she had become someone people would remember with hatred. She wrote that this didn't surprise her, didn't particularly disturb her, because hatred was at least recognition. People who were hated were not invisible. The entry was the closest Sarah ever came to explaining herself in writing. She closed the ledger, locked it away, and didn't write in it again for 3 months. Daniel was 26 years old when he disappeared from the Humphrey plantation in March of 1831. He was unusual in several ways. He had been taught to read and write by the plantation owner's father, who had died in 1823, and whose son had reversed the policy of education. Daniel worked as a carpenter, building and repairing structures across the plantation, and occasionally hired out to neighboring properties. His skills made him valuable, which meant his owner had posted a $100 reward for his return, the highest amount Sarah had seen for a single person who wasn't a repeat offender. What made Daniel exceptional wasn't just his literacy or his skills, it was the way he had planned his escape. Most people who fled made the decision impulsively, driven by immediate crisis or opportunity. They ran without adequate preparation and were captured within days. Daniel had spent 2 years planning. He had saved money from the small payments he received for hired-out work. He had studied maps. He had identified people along the Underground Railroad who might help. He had forged free papers so convincing that they would pass all but the most scrutinizing examination. And he had created a misdirection. On the night he disappeared, Daniel left signs suggesting he was heading west toward the Green River. In reality, he went north toward Louisville. Sarah took the contract on March 8, 1831. She studied Daniel's background, recognized his intelligence, and understood immediately that this would not be a typical case. An intelligent person with resources and a plan would not make obvious mistakes. Sarah would need to think differently, anticipate differently. She began by assuming everything Daniel wanted her to believe was wrong. If Daniel left signs pointing west, he probably went north or east. If he had forged free papers, he would likely travel openly during daylight, posing as a free craftsman looking for work. If he had help, it would come from people with connections to literate black communities, not just from typical Underground Railroad stations. Sarah revised her strategy accordingly. She sent messages to her informants in Jefferson County, asking about any black carpenters who had appeared in Louisville recently, anyone offering services, anyone staying at boarding houses or churches. Within 2 days, she received a response. A man matching Daniel's description had been seen at a Methodist church on Jefferson Street, speaking with the minister about potential work repairing the church's roof. Sarah rode to Louisville immediately. The minister, a man named Reverend Coulter, confirmed that a carpenter named Daniel Freeman had visited 3 days prior. Freeman had shown excellent credentials, had explained he was traveling north to Cincinnati where he had family, and was taking small jobs along the way to fund his journey. The Reverend had been impressed. He had hired Freeman to repair the church roof, paid him $3, and sent him on his way with a recommendation letter to Methodist communities in Ohio. Sarah asked where Freeman had gone next. The Reverend said Cincinnati, as far as he knew. Sarah thanked him and left, but she didn't believe the Cincinnati story. It was too obvious, too perfectly aligned with what someone wanting to reach free territory would say. If Daniel was as smart as he appeared, he would know that Cincinnati was the expected destination, which meant he might be going somewhere else first. Sarah spent the next week tracking Daniel through methodical questioning and observation. She found a boarding house owner who had rented him a room for 2 nights. She found a store clerk who had sold him traveling supplies. She found a ferry operator who remembered someone matching his description, asking about passages to various points along the Ohio River, not just Cincinnati. The ferry operator mentioned that Freeman had seemed particularly interested in crossing near Madison, Indiana, a town with a significant free black population. Madison was 100 miles from Louisville. Sarah calculated Daniel had about a 4-day head start. If he was walking, he would average 25 miles per day. If he had hired a horse, faster. Sarah chose to pursue by horse, pushing hard to close the distance. She rode south along the river roads, stopping at every town and settlement. In each place, she asked about Freeman, showed a physical description, offered small payments for information. On March 15th, in a town called Bethlehem, Sarah found someone who had seen Daniel. A stable owner reported that a black carpenter matching the description had paid to shelter in the stable for 1 night, 2 days prior. The man had been heading east, not north toward Madison. East meant he was moving away from the river into the hill country of Jefferson County, away from obvious escape routes. Sarah realized what Daniel was doing. He was circling back, waiting for the initial search to die down before making his real attempt to cross. Sarah adjusted her pursuit. She stopped moving forward and started searching laterally, covering the area between Bethlehem and the river. On March the 17th, she found Daniel hiding in an abandoned mill near Jeffersontown. He was alone, his supplies nearly gone, waiting for the right moment to head back toward the river. When Sarah entered the mill with her rifle, Daniel stood slowly and said, "I knew someone would find me eventually. I didn't think it would be you." "Why not me?" Sarah asked. "Because you're smart," Daniel said. "Smart enough to know what you're doing is wrong." They looked at each other in the dusty light filtering through the mill's broken windows. Sarah could have shackled him immediately, but something about the way Daniel spoke, without fear or anger, made her pause. She asked him why he ran. Daniel said because he wanted to be free. He said it simply, as if the answer was obvious, as if wanting freedom was the most natural thing in the world. Sarah asked if he had family. Daniel said he had a wife still at the Humphrey plantation and a daughter 7 years old. He had planned to send for them once he reached safety, once he had earned enough money working as a free carpenter to purchase their freedom. He had calculated it would take 3 years of savings. He said this knowing Sarah would return him, knowing his plan was over, but he said it anyway because he wanted her to know the plan had existed, had been real, had been possible if only he had been slightly faster or slightly luckier. Sarah shackled him. She brought him back to Louisville, delivered him to Wardle's office, collected the $100 reward. The Humphrey overseer took Daniel back to the plantation. Sarah heard later that Daniel had been sold to a cotton plantation in Mississippi as punishment for running, separated from his wife and daughter. The 3-year plan to reunite his family destroyed by 1 week's bad luck. Sarah wrote Daniel's name in her 4th ledger. She wrote what he had said about being smart. She wrote that he had been right. She was smart enough to know what she was doing. She just wasn't good enough to stop. In the summer of 1831, Sarah noticed something in her ledgers that she had been avoiding. Over the previous 5 years, she had captured 137 people. Of those, 74 had been captured within 5 days of fleeing. 49 had been captured within 10 days. Only 14 had remained free for more than 2 weeks. The pattern was clear. If someone could survive the first 2 weeks, their chances of reaching freedom increased dramatically. But most people couldn't survive those 2 weeks because Sarah's network was too dense, too efficient, too thorough. This realization should have pleased her. It was evidence of her professional competence, proof that her system worked. But instead, it made her feel something she hadn't expected. A kind of exhaustion, not physical, though the work was demanding, but a deeper exhaustion that came from knowing exactly how the system functioned, knowing every step, every tactic, every inevitable outcome. She was too good at her job. She had perfected a machine for capturing desperate people, and the perfection itself was beginning to hollow her out. In July of that year, Sarah declined a contract for the first time based purely on fatigue. A woman named Caroline had fled from a plantation in Spencer County. The reward was $50. The case was straightforward, the kind Sarah would normally pursue immediately. But when Wardle brought her the paperwork, Sarah said she needed time. She said she was occupied with another case, which was a lie. She simply didn't want to track Caroline, didn't want to add another name to her fourth ledger, didn't want to spend days hunting someone who would inevitably be caught because the system allowed no other outcome. Wardle accepted this without comment. He assigned the contract to another contractor. Caroline was captured within a week. Sarah heard about it through her network. The capture had been brutal. The contractor, a man named Pike, had used dogs. Caroline had been bitten before she was shackled. She would carry scars for the rest of her life, assuming she survived whatever punishment her owner imposed. Sarah tried not to think about this, tried to tell herself it wasn't her responsibility, that Caroline would have been captured regardless of who took the contract. But she couldn't quite convince herself. In August, Sarah declined another contract, then another in September. She was still working, still capturing people, but with less frequency. She accepted cases that interested her, that posed challenges, that required the skills she had developed. But the routine captures, the ones that any competent tracker could handle, she started refusing. Wardle noticed the change but didn't press her. Sarah was still his most successful contractor overall. If she wanted to be selective, she had earned that privilege. But Sarah's selectivity had consequences. Other contractors started taking the cases she refused, and some of those contractors were worse than she was. More violent, less careful, more willing to brutalize the people they captured. Sarah heard stories. A man who had been returned with both arms broken. A woman who had been assaulted by her captor during the journey back. A teenage boy who had been beaten so severely he died 3 days after being delivered to his owner. These outcomes hadn't happened when Sarah controlled the majority of contracts in her region. She had been efficient, but not cruel. Now, by stepping back, she was allowing cruelty to fill the space she had occupied. This was the trap she couldn't escape. If she worked, she captured people and destroyed their attempts at freedom. If she didn't work, someone worse than her would do it instead, with more violence and less care. There was no version where she made things better. There was only choosing what degree of harm she was personally responsible for versus what degree she enabled by stepping aside. In October of 1831, a case came through that forced Sarah to confront this trap directly. 3 people had fled the Whitfield plantation in Bullitt County. 2 men and a woman traveling together, heading north. The reward was $150 combined. Jacob Wardell offered the contract to Sarah, and Sarah declined. She was tired. She didn't want this case. She wanted to be left alone with her ledgers and her money and her empty house on Carter's Ridge. Wardell assigned the contract to Pike, the same contractor who had used dogs on Caroline. Pike tracked the 3 people to a creek near Shepherdsville, where they had stopped to rest. He didn't bother with negotiation or careful capture. He set the dogs on them immediately. One of the men was killed trying to fight the dogs off. The other man and the woman were severely injured. Pike brought back 2 people instead of 3, collected a reduced reward, and filed a report that the 3rd death was justified self-defense. The plantation owner accepted this. The legal system accepted this. A person was dead, and nobody in authority cared. Sarah heard about this outcome and felt something crack inside her. She had refused the contract to spare herself, but her refusal had enabled Pike, which meant the death was partially her responsibility. If she had taken the contract, all 3 people would have been captured, but they would have been captured alive, unharmed, with the chance of surviving whatever came after. Now one was dead, and Sarah couldn't pretend that death had nothing to do with her. She sat in her house that evening and opened her 4th ledger. She didn't write a name. She wrote a question. How many deaths am I responsible for by refusing to do the work myself? She had no answer. She closed the ledger and sat in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the trees on Carter's Ridge, thinking about paths not taken and choices that destroyed people, regardless of which option she selected. Samuel Ryder was not enslaved. He was a free black man who lived in Louisville, worked as a mason, owned his home, and maintained legal documentation proving his free status. He was 43 years old in November of 1831 when Sarah Carter knocked on his door with shackles in her hand and a contract claiming he was a runaway from a plantation in Tennessee. The contract was fraudulent. Someone had forged documents claiming Samuel was actually a man named Moses, who had fled the Garrison plantation 3 years prior. The forger had matched physical descriptions carefully, used Samuel's approximate age and height, and filed the paperwork with a Tennessee county clerk who didn't question the legitimacy. The reward was $120, high enough to be attractive, and the contract had been passed through several intermediaries before reaching Jacob Wardell in Louisville. Wardell, who didn't personally verify every contract he received, passed it to Sarah. Sarah knocked on Samuel's door at dawn. When he answered, she explained she was there to collect him under the Fugitive Slave Act. Samuel showed her his free papers, which were legitimate, recorded with the Jefferson County clerk, and backed by testimony from Louisville citizens who could verify his status. Sarah should have recognized immediately that the contract was wrong, but she had been trained to distrust black people's claims of freedom. Forged free papers existed. Lies were common, and the contract in her hand looked official. Sarah insisted Samuel come with her for verification. Samuel refused. He told her to take the contract to the county clerk, compare it against his registered free papers, and confirm the error. He would wait in his house while she did this. Sarah said that wasn't acceptable. She said he would come with her now, or she would report to the sheriff that he was resisting legal apprehension. Samuel asked what legal authority Sarah had to compel him. She was not a sheriff, not a marshal, not an official with power to arrest. She was a private contractor with a dubious contract. This was the moment Sarah's system failed. She had built her reputation on being able to capture anyone, overcome any resistance, complete any contract. But Samuel was neither fleeing nor frightened. He was a free man with legal documentation, standing in his own home, calmly explaining that Sarah had no authority over him, and he was correct. If Sarah attempted to take him by force, she would be committing kidnapping. If the contract was fraudulent, as Samuel claimed, she had no legal protection. Sarah withdrew. She took the contract to the county clerk's office and requested verification. The clerk compared the contract against Samuel Ryder's registered documents and confirmed that Samuel was legally free, had been free for his entire life, and was not the person described in the Tennessee contract. The contract was fraudulent. Sarah had been hired to capture someone who didn't exist. She returned to Samuel's house that afternoon and apologized. Samuel accepted the apology but told her something else. He said he knew about her network of informants. He knew how she operated, who she paid, who she coerced. And he said the free black community in Louisville had been documenting her activities for years. They had kept their own ledgers, recording every person Sarah had captured, every informant she had used, every method she employed. They were building a case that could potentially be presented to federal authorities if Kentucky's legal structure ever changed enough to allow prosecution. Sarah asked why they hadn't done this already. Samuel said because the current legal system protected her. But he said systems change. He said slavery wouldn't last forever, that it carried the seeds of its own destruction. And when it fell, people like Sarah would face accounting. He said the ledgers existed not to threaten her now, but to ensure memory later, so that when the reckoning came, nobody could claim ignorance or innocence. Sarah left Samuel's house and rode back to Carter's Ridge. She sat in her study with her 4 ledgers and thought about what Samuel had said. She had believed her work was private, that only she kept full records. But she had been wrong. The communities she terrorized had been watching her as carefully as she watched them. They had names, dates, methods. They had built their own archive of her actions. And someday, perhaps decades from now, those archives might matter. Sarah didn't change her behavior. She continued accepting contracts, continued capturing people, continued operating her informant network. But Samuel's revelation had introduced a new uncertainty. She now knew she was being observed, documented, judged by people who had no power to stop her now, but who believed they would have power eventually. This changed the work's texture. It made her conscious that her actions were not just present-tense transactions, but were being recorded for a future she might not live to see, but which would remember her regardless. In March of 1832, Sarah Carter was 47 years old and had been working as a slave catcher for 7 years. She had captured 212 people. She had earned over $15,000, a fortune by the standards of rural Kentucky. She owned 3 properties in Jefferson County, had investments in Louisville banks, and could have retired comfortably. But she continued working, driven by reasons even she couldn't fully articulate. The work had become her identity. Without it, she would return to being what she had been before Thomas died. Nobody. The contract that changed everything arrived on March 9th. A woman named Harriet had disappeared from the Morrison plantation in Shelby County on March 3rd. She was 29 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, missing the tip of her left ring finger from an old injury. The reward was $75. The contract was routine. Sarah accepted it without special consideration. She began tracking Harriet through her usual methods, questioning informants, mapping likely routes, searching for patterns. On March 12th, Sarah received information that Harriet had been seen near a Quaker settlement in Henry County. This was complicated, but manageable. Sarah had connections in that area, including Ezra Whitson, the farmer she had coerced into cooperation years earlier. She sent a message to Whitson asking if he knew anything about a woman matching Harriet's description. Whitson responded that he didn't, but he mentioned that a family named Patterson had recently arrived in the area and had been attending Quaker meetings. The Pattersons had a cousin visiting, a woman from out of county. Whitson didn't know if this was relevant, but Sarah had taught him to report anything unusual. Sarah rode to Henry County and positioned herself where she could observe the Patterson farm. She saw the usual activities for 3 days. Then, on March 15th, she saw a woman leave the house who matched Harriet's description. The woman was helping with outdoor chores, moving freely, acting as if she belonged. Sarah confirmed the missing fingertip from a distance using her spyglass. It was Harriet. Sarah waited until dark, then approached the house. She knocked and explained to Mr. Patterson that she was there to collect a woman he was harboring illegally. Patterson, an elderly man with limited hearing, was confused. He said his cousin was visiting from Oldham County, that she was a free woman, that there was no one in his house who was enslaved. Sarah insisted on speaking with Harriet directly. When Harriet came to the door, she had documents. Freedom papers issued in Oldham County 2 years prior. The papers looked legitimate, showed Harriet's name and description, bore an official seal. Sarah examined them carefully. They were convincing, but something was wrong. The fingertip injury wasn't mentioned in the Freedom Papers' physical description. That omission was unusual. Most Freedom Papers documented scars or distinguishing features precisely to prevent exactly this kind of confusion. Sarah asked Harriet direct questions. Where had she lived in Oldham County? What was the name of the person who had manumitted her? Where had she worked? Harriet answered all of these calmly, providing details that could potentially be verified. Sarah thanked her, apologized for the intrusion, and left. But she didn't leave the area. She sent messages to contacts in Oldham County asking them to verify Harriet's story. The responses came back 3 days later. There was a woman matching Harriet's description who had been freed in Oldham County 2 years prior. The Freedom Papers Sarah had seen were likely authentic, but Sarah's contact also mentioned something else. The freed woman in Oldham County had married and moved to Indiana in 1831. She was currently living in a free black settlement near Madison, which meant the woman at the Patterson farm, regardless of what her papers claimed, was not the person those papers described. Sarah had found Harriet. The Freedom Papers were fraudulent, well-made but not legitimate. Someone had forged them, probably using the real Freedom Papers from the Oldham County woman as a template. Harriet had acquired these forged documents and was using them to live as if she were free, to stay with sympathetic Quakers who believed her story, to build a life outside bondage. Sarah returned to the Patterson farm on March 19th. She confronted Harriet with the verification from Oldham County. She explained that the real owner of those Freedom Papers was in Indiana, that Harriet was using forged documents, that under Kentucky law she was still enslaved and subject to return. Harriet didn't deny it. She simply said that she had been free for 16 days, that she had lived as a free person would live, and that those 16 days were worth whatever happened next. Sarah shackled her, but as she was preparing to take Harriet back to Louisville, something happened that had never happened before. The Patterson family intervened. Not just Mr. Patterson, but his wife, his adult children, and several other Quaker families who lived nearby. They surrounded Sarah and Harriet, forming a physical barrier between Sarah and the road. They didn't threaten violence. Quakers didn't believe in violence, but they said they would not allow Sarah to take Harriet. They said the laws that made slavery legal were unjust, that they would not cooperate with those laws, and that Sarah would have to physically push through them or call the sheriff if she wanted to proceed. Sarah had faced resistance before, but never like this. Never organized, never communal, never backed by people who genuinely believed they were performing a moral duty. She could have ridden to the sheriff's office and returned with legal authority, but that would take time, and by the time she returned, Harriet would be gone, hidden somewhere else in the Quaker network. Sarah made a decision. She fought her way through, not violently. She didn't shoot anyone. She didn't hurt anyone. But she pushed forward on her horse, forcing people to step aside or be trampled. She dragged Harriet behind her, the woman shackled and stumbling. The Quakers shouted at her, called her an abomination, said she would face divine judgment. Sarah ignored them. She reached the road and rode hard toward Louisville, putting distance between herself and the Patterson farm before anyone could organize further resistance. She delivered Harriet to Wardle's office on March 20th. The Morrison overseer verified the capture and paid the $75 reward. Harriet was returned to the plantation. Sarah collected her money, and then she went home to Carter's Ridge and sat in her empty house, thinking about the Quaker families forming a wall between her and the road, thinking about how many times she would have to push through walls like that if the work continued, thinking about whether, at some point, the walls would become too solid to break. Sarah Carter stopped accepting new contracts in April of 1832. She didn't announce this decision. She simply stopped responding to Jacob Wardle's messages about new cases. When Wardle visited her at Carter's Ridge to ask why, Sarah said she needed rest. She said 7 years of work had exhausted her, that she wanted time to manage her properties and investments. Wardle accepted this explanation. He had other contractors. Sarah's absence would be noticed, but not catastrophic for his business. Sarah spent the spring and summer of 1832 doing what she claimed, managing properties, reviewing finances, living quietly. But she also spent time with her ledgers, particularly the fourth one, the private record of everyone she had captured. She read through the names, the dates, the details she had written. 212 entries. 212 people whose attempts at freedom she had ended. The number felt both abstract and overwhelming. How does a person carry that weight? In July, Sarah received unexpected visitors. 2 men arrived at her house, both well-dressed, both carrying themselves with the authority of people accustomed to being obeyed. They introduced themselves as representatives of plantation owners in Tennessee and Mississippi. They had heard of Sarah's reputation and wanted to offer her a contract, a major case, multiple people, high rewards, significant challenges. They offered her $500, more than she had ever been offered for a single contract. Sarah asked for details. The men explained that a group of 15 people had escaped from connected plantations in western Tennessee. They had been missing for 3 weeks, which suggested they had reached significant distance and had help. The owners wanted Sarah to track them, capture as many as possible, and send a message to Underground Railroad operators in the region that organized escapes would face sophisticated opposition. Sarah listened to the proposal, asked clarifying questions, and declined. The men were surprised. They increased the offer to $750. Sarah declined again. They asked what she wanted. More money? Different terms? Sarah said she didn't want anything. She was finished with the work. The men left, confused and frustrated. That Sarah Carter, the most successful slave catcher in Kentucky, would refuse the largest contract ever offered made no sense to them. But it made sense to Sarah. She had reached a limit she couldn't name but could feel. The work had taken something from her that money couldn't replace. In August, news reached Kentucky about Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia. Enslaved people had risen up, killed 57 white people, and sparked terror across the South before being suppressed. The rebellion was over within days, but its psychological impact lasted much longer. Plantation owners became paranoid, implemented harsher controls, increased surveillance. The demand for slave catchers increased dramatically as owners became more determined to prevent escapes that might lead to organized resistance. Jacob Wardell contacted Sarah multiple times in the weeks after the Turner rebellion, urging her to resume work. The market for her skills had never been stronger. Rewards were higher. Contracts were plentiful. But Sarah refused all of them. She told Wardell she was permanently retired from contracting. Wardell asked if he could refer people to her for advice, training, consultation. Sarah said no. She wanted no further connection to the work. This decision cost her financially. Not immediately, but over time. Sarah had built her wealth on continuous income from contracts. Without that income, she relied on her investments and property rents. These were substantial, but not as lucrative as active contracting. By 1833, Sarah had to sell one of her properties to maintain her lifestyle. By 1834, she had to sell another. Her fortune, built over 7 years, began slowly eroding. But Sarah didn't resume contracting. Whatever had changed in her during that confrontation at the Patterson farm remained changed. She couldn't explain it, even to herself. She hadn't developed sudden moral clarity. She hadn't become an abolitionist. She still believed slavery was legal, that she had been within her rights to do the work she had done. But she couldn't continue. Some internal mechanism had broken, and the work was no longer possible. In November of 1834, Sarah received a letter from Samuel Ryder, the free black mason she had nearly captured years earlier. Ryder wrote that he wanted to speak with her about a matter of mutual interest. He suggested they meet at a neutral location in Louisville. Sarah was curious enough to agree. They met at a public park near the waterfront. Ryder told her about the ledgers the black community had kept, the documentation of her activities, the informant networks, the methods. He said the community was maintaining these records not just as historical documentation, but as active protection. If Sarah resumed contracting, if she threatened their community again, the ledgers would be presented to sympathetic attorneys and clergymen who might use them to create legal or social consequences. Ryder said this calmly, not as a threat, but as information. Sarah asked why he was telling her this now. Ryder said because she had stopped working, and the community wanted to ensure she stayed stopped. He said people in Louisville's black community had noticed her retirement. They had watched to see if it was temporary. After 2 years of her refusing contracts, they believed it was permanent. Ryder wanted Sarah to know that this retirement was the only thing preventing the ledgers from becoming active tools against her. Sarah understood. Her retirement wasn't just personal choice, it was survival. If she resumed work, she would face organized opposition from communities who had spent years preparing to resist her. The days of operating without consequence were over. The networks she had terrorized had built their own networks, and those networks were watching. Sarah thanked Ryder for the information and returned to Carter's Ridge. She locked her 4 ledgers in a drawer and didn't open them again for 3 years. Sarah Carter died on November 3, 1843, at 58 years old. The cause of death, recorded by a Louisville physician, was a fever that developed into pneumonia. She died in her house on Carter's Ridge, alone, having outlived most of the people who had known her during her contracting years. Jacob Wardell had died in 1839. Many of the plantation owners she had worked for had died or moved west. The world she had operated in was already changing, though slavery itself remained entrenched. Sarah left no will. She had no children, no close relatives who survived her. Her remaining property was sold at auction to settle minor debts. The total value of her estate was $1,700, a fraction of what she had accumulated during her peak years. Most of her wealth had been spent maintaining her lifestyle during retirement, when income ceased, but expenses continued. She died not poor, but not wealthy, comfortable, but not secure. The Louisville newspaper ran a brief obituary. It noted Sarah Carter's death, mentioned that she had been the widow of Thomas Carter, and listed her property holdings. It made no mention of her work as a slave catcher. That part of her life was omitted, as if it had never happened. Sarah was buried in a Louisville cemetery in an unmarked section where less prominent citizens were interred. No stone was raised, no memorial created. She disappeared into the ground without marker or recognition. But Sarah Carter was not forgotten, particularly not by the communities she had terrorized. Her name continued to circulate in Louisville's black community for decades after her death. Parents told their children about the white woman who had hunted people with methodical efficiency. The stories grew with telling, became legendary, exaggerated in some details, but accurate in their core. Sarah had been real. Her network had been real. The captures had been real. And the community remembered. In the 1850s, as tensions over slavery intensified and the country moved toward civil war, Sarah's methods were studied and copied by other slave catchers. Her informant networks became templates for expanded surveillance systems. Her tactics of patience and prediction influenced how bounty hunters operated across the South. She had perfected techniques that others replicated, and those techniques increased the danger faced by people attempting escape. Sarah's legacy lived not in monuments or records, but in the systematic hunting of human beings. The Civil War began in 1861. Kentucky, a border state, remained in the Union but maintained slavery until the 13th Amendment abolished the institution in 1865. Many of the plantations Sarah had served were destroyed during the war. Families she had worked for lost their wealth, their influence, their entire way of life. The system that had made Sarah's work possible, that had rewarded her for capturing people, collapsed completely. After the war, during Reconstruction, some of the ledgers Samuel Ryder had mentioned came to light. Not Sarah's personal ledgers, those were never found, but the community records that documented her activities. These ledgers were presented to federal authorities as evidence of the systematic violence that had maintained slavery. They became part of a larger archive documenting the infrastructure of oppression. Sarah Carter's name appeared in multiple entries, always as a contractor, a captor, a hunter. One entry, dated November 15, 1829, listed Sarah's capture of a man named Isaac and included a note. Captured by S. Carter, known to have extensive informant network, payment to network members approximately $5 monthly, operates primarily Jefferson through Shelby counties. Another entry from April 1830 listed the capture of Anna from the Shelby family carriage house and included, S. Carter warned M. Shelby not to assist further escapes, used evidence of illegal harboring as coercion rather than prosecution. These entries, compiled by people who had been documenting Sarah while she thought she operated invisibly, provided a detailed picture of how one woman had built a system of capture that terrorized multiple communities. The ledgers showed the economics, the methods, the human cost. They were archived in federal records, mostly ignored during the chaotic Reconstruction years, but preserved. Waiting. In 1893, a historian researching Kentucky's antebellum period discovered references to Sarah Carter in county records. He tracked down the community ledgers and wrote a brief article about her for a regional historical journal. The article described Sarah as an unusually successful contractor who demonstrated that slave catching could be operated with business-like efficiency rather than merely brutality. The article was sympathetic to Sarah, treating her as an interesting historical figure rather than as someone who had participated in systemic oppression. This sympathetic treatment outraged people who remembered or had family stories about Sarah's actual impact. Letters poured into the journal from black families in Louisville and surrounding counties, explaining what Sarah had really done, how many people she had captured, how her network had made escape nearly impossible. These letters provided personal testimony. Grandparents who remembered seeing Sarah ride through their communities. Stories of people who had been captured and never seen again. Accounts of informants who had betrayed their own neighbors for Sarah's payments. The journal published some of these letters in a follow-up issue, and the debate over how to remember Sarah Carter began. Was she an efficient professional who operated within her time's legal framework? Or was she an architect of suffering who had perfected techniques for destroying people's attempts at freedom? The question didn't have a simple answer because both were true. Sarah had been legal and monstrous, competent and cruel, systematic and destructive. What the debate revealed was that memory itself was contested. Who got to tell Sarah's story? The historians who saw her as an interesting case study, or the communities who had survived her hunting? The resolution, if it could be called that, was fragmentation. Sarah was remembered differently by different groups. Academic historians noted her as an example of privatized slave catching. Black communities remembered her as a terror. And most people, most white Kentuckians who had no direct connection to slavery, didn't remember her at all. By the 1960s, Sarah Carter was mostly forgotten except by specialized historians and families with long memories. Her name appeared in footnotes of academic works about slave catching, always briefly, never centrally. She was not important enough to warrant extended study, not representative enough to stand as a symbol. She was one contractor among many, exceptional in her success, but not unique in her methods. History moved past her. The house on Carter's Ridge burned down in 1928. The fire was ruled accidental, probably started by lightning, but some older residents of Louisville remembered whose house it had been and wondered if the fire carried meaning beyond weather. By then, the land had been subdivided and sold to developers. The ridge where Sarah had sat with her spyglass watching Louisville became a residential neighborhood. Nothing marked the site as significant. No plaque, no recognition. The place where Sarah Carter had lived and planned her captures became ordinary space, indistinguishable from any other Kentucky hillside. But stories survive when places don't. In Louisville's black community, Sarah Carter's name continued to surface in family histories and oral traditions. The stories were not always accurate in detail, 7 generations of telling introduced embellishments, but they were accurate in essence. A white woman had hunted people systematically. She had used informants and surveillance. She had been very good at her work and very dangerous because of it. The stories served a purpose. They reminded younger generations that oppression had many faces, that not all violence came from obvious sources, that systems of control could be bureaucratic and efficient rather than merely brutal. In contemporary times, historians occasionally rediscover Sarah Carter while researching broader topics. A dissertation on Kentucky's Underground Railroad might mention her. A book about women in the antebellum South might include a paragraph about her unusual profession. A documentary about slave catching might feature a brief segment. But Sarah remains peripheral, a footnote to larger stories. She is not important enough for a biography, not sympathetic enough for rehabilitation, not dramatic enough for popular memory, which is perhaps appropriate. Sarah Carter was not a central figure in Kentucky's history. She was a tool of a system, efficient but replaceable. She succeeded because the legal and economic structures of slavery rewarded her work. When those structures collapsed, her success became irrelevant. She died in obscurity, was buried without marker, and faded from memory except in the communities she had harmed most directly. The fourth ledger, the one where Sarah recorded names and details of everyone she captured, was never found. Either it was destroyed, or it remains hidden somewhere, perhaps in a descendant's attic, perhaps in an archive box that nobody has examined closely. If it still exists, it contains 212 names, 212 people whose stories are otherwise mostly lost. The ledger would be valuable not because it rehabilitates Sarah, but because it documents the people she captured. It would give names to history's silences. But even without the ledger, the impact remains. Sarah Carter captured 212 people over 7 years. Each capture destroyed an escape attempt, returned someone to bondage, demonstrated that flight was difficult and often futile. Her efficiency discouraged others from trying. Her network of informants created distrust that lingered for generations. Her methods became templates that other slave catchers used. The mathematics of her influence extend far beyond the 212 individuals she personally shackled. She created a system, and systems perpetuate themselves. In Louisville today, occasional discussions arise about whether historical markers should acknowledge uncomfortable truths about the city's past. Whether slavery's infrastructure, including the work of slave catchers, should be documented and memorialized. These discussions are contentious. Some argue that acknowledging such history is necessary for understanding how oppression functioned. Others argue that memorializing people like Sarah Carter, even critically, gives them a prominence they don't deserve. The debate remains unresolved. Sarah Carter's house is gone, her grave is unmarked, her ledgers are lost, and her story is mostly forgotten. But on certain Louisville streets, in certain families, the name still surfaces. Stories still get told. Children still hear about the woman who hunted people, who built a network of surveillance, who made escape nearly impossible. The stories may not be entirely accurate, but they carry a truth that historical records sometimes miss. They remember that systems of oppression are built by individuals making choices, and those choices, even when legal, even when profitable, even when efficient, carry costs that outlast the people who made them. They say on November nights, when fog rolls off the Ohio River and settles into Louisville's old neighborhoods, you can still feel the surveillance Sarah Carter created, like something watching from the ridges above the city, noting who moves where, who helps whom, who dares to run. Subscribe if you want the next deep dive.